Welcome to All Workforce Matters. I'm Teresa Miele, your host for the Rutland Region Workforce Investment Board. Today we're going to be talking about the Ban the Box legislation and the impact that it's having. I have two guests with me, Kris Bascue, the account business manager for Creative Workforce Solutions. Welcome. And Keith Tallon, who is the district manager at Probation and Parole right here in Rutland. Welcome, Keith.
Good morning. Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about the legislation. I don't know if either one of you want to jump in. There's not lots to it, but if you want to talk a little bit about why that's important to us.
Go ahead.
So as of July 1st, the legislation states that it's no longer legal for employers to have the question about criminal histories on their application process. That does not stop a business from asking about your criminal history during the interview, but it does eliminate the question on the application. Why I feel that's important: it offers somebody with criminal history an opportunity to sell their skills versus their criminal history.
Absolutely, getting a foot in the door. Keith, would you have anything to add to that and why you feel it's important in your experience?
Well, actually, I'm going to quote Governor Shumlin, who was responsible for the initiative from the governor's office. That he said that banning the box is all about breaking down barriers and giving those Vermonters who have paid their debt to society a fair chance of finding a good job. So I think really that is the essence of it. It's people who have had a criminal past, obviously, but who are looking to start a new life, and employment being a very critical part of bringing that new life into fruition. So I think it's an assistance to them as they go forward to a prospective employer, that's not the first thing that's discussed or looked at the application, and they really get a chance to interview the person before going any further. So. And looking at that history. I think that's really critical.
I agree with you. I think that really captures it. So to any of our employers out there in our viewing audience, if you have that question on your application, you want to review that. I know there are a couple of exceptions for some employment sectors. However, overall, you shouldn't have that on your application. And it does allow you to really get introduced to some viable candidates who have the skills and abilities, or who can acquire those skills on the job. And that may be a population of employees or applicants that you haven't even looked at. So with unemployment being really tight, it's really a great opportunity for employers to kind of set eyes on the person and have a conversation about what the job is really about. And then if appropriate, or if it makes sense to have that conversation, to then ask that question during the interviewing or screening process.
Absolutely.
I think it's important to remember also that a number of these prospective candidates come to the application process having had good experience in the past before that they got into trouble. So it could have been because of addiction that they got into trouble, but they really left full-time employment, and so they really have a good background in a particular area. So
I think that's really important, because very often I think that we look at a group, and in this particular example, or the population of folks that we're talking about, we look at people as a group and we label.
Absolutely.
And then we can't get past the label. So let's talk a little bit about some employers who are getting past the label. I know we can't talk specifically about those employers, but in your experience, how do some of those employers get past that label? What are they doing differently than employers who maybe aren't as open or available to this idea?
So as I go out and talk to businesses, one of the things and the feedback that I receive a lot, those businesses are willing to take the opportunity on somebody with criminal history. It's about the relationship, honestly. It's about the interview process. It's about how the person with criminal history really discloses their criminal history. And really the most important thing is where they've come from since then. So the interview process is where I see those businesses taking the opportunity to work with people with criminal histories. It's during the interview process. I think it's how the person with criminal history really discloses, makes that employer feel comfortable, and they can start to delve into maybe there's a story behind this, or people do make mistakes. I often find that those employers are more concerned about the rest of their staff on site, and this is my family, this is my business, and are you going to be safe here? And is everybody else going to be safe here? And once they've cleared that hurdle, usually we see success.
So in particular, Creative Workforce Solutions, would be available to work with employers to talk about some of the things that they might want to be thinking about, addressing just kind of those broader strokes of safety in the workplace and appropriate questions to be asking, or breaking down some of the barriers.
Absolutely.
So how would an employer go about getting in touch with you to have that conversation?
So, you know, as you saw in the beginning of the show, my number is out there. I welcome any phone call. My role as a business account manager is just that, to support the businesses in our Rutland community. And some of the things I can do is I'm more than willing to come meet and talk about what I can do to help support the business as they go forward in considering somebody with a criminal history. There's a lot of programs out there that also helps the business, where we talk about the work opportunity tax credit and things of that nature. The bonding process with Department of Labor is a good tool to use as well, which really helps the business. If there's anything that takes place on the job site, somebody with a criminal history is eligible to be bonded through the Department of Labor, and there could be some sort of money recouped if something were to happen at the business. Quite honestly, it's not very often that you see that the bonding needs to be used. So, but there's a lot of tools, and I'm willing to go out and talk with any business about hiring anybody.
So how much are you going to charge?
I'll do it for free. We'll do
free.
it for free.
That's awesome. So in terms of the incentives, one of the things that I know we wanted to touch on is that not only can you get someone who has some history of skill and experience that they're bringing forth with them, but there are work opportunity tax credits available to employers, bonding if it's necessary, and a variety of other incentives that benefit that employer as well as that candidate or employee. So with regard to probation and parole, that's how you and I first met when I started working at Rutland Plywood, and we had a really strong working relationship. Talk a little bit about what is available for support through probation and parole to employees and employers.
That's great. I just want to echo something that Kris said earlier in regard to the interviews. From our perspective, the probation officer working with a particular client that's looking for employment, the first thing that's stressed from that probation officer to that client is for them to be honest when they go to the interview. And I think that that's really been responsible for a change in attitude in a number of employers, that because they value honesty. And when you start with honesty and then explain the offense, it's much better than coming from a position of not being honest up front. And I think employers are really appreciative of that fact, and that's a value that can carry them through even a poor criminal history in terms of their accessing that particular job. But going back to your question, I think it's important for employers to know that if there is a person on supervision, that they're aware of that person being on supervision, that they have a link with the probation officer, and they could call that probation officer anytime. And what was so successful with you at Rutland Plywood is that the probation officer would link with the employer, and if there was any concern, whether it's tardiness or absence or just work habits, then that probation officer can reinforce what's required by the employer and really keep that person motivated to maintain that employment, because it's so important for them to maintain based on the economics of living in the community, be it rent, food, and all those things that are important for them to be successful. So the probation officer is more than willing to talk to an employer, and we've had great success. I had an employer once call me because they actually were concerned about a particular employee that actually went back to incarceration for a minor offense, and he was most interested in understanding when he could get that employee back to work. So I think generally what I've seen over the last 6 years that I've been in this office is employers have been more and more than willing to take a chance, so to speak, and give a second chance. I just did a quick survey with probation officers in the office the other day of how many employers out there are hiring our people under supervision. quickly, there was like 26 businesses, employers that popped up through just only a handful of probation officers surveying. So that's really encouraging.
That's fantastic.
And they represent all types of employers in the city and in the county. So that's great.
That's very exciting.
So we're very appreciative as a department.
That's a quick snapshot. From my role, I would say that number is actually quite a bit higher of businesses who will consider somebody with a criminal history. Most generally, it's a case by case, and again, it really goes back to the offenses. What have they done since those offenses, and how are they able to talk about those offenses? So if they make an employer feel comfortable, more often than not, you'll see a potential for hire.
I know one of the concerns that's been expressed since Rutland Plywood burned is, where are people getting employed? Because as you both know, there was a longstanding commitment to hiring people with criminal backgrounds at Rutland Plywood. And that's where I first became exposed to hiring people with criminal histories, because the employers that I worked for before, it wasn't a possibility just because of some of the rules and regulations. And I have to tell you, which I've said to both of you before, it was honestly a little scary. It was pretty off-putting, but I was plunged into that because I was working for an employer who was wholeheartedly committed. And I learned a lot. It's probably one of the best experiences as an employer and a human resources professional I've ever had. I met a lot of really interesting people, and it allowed me to remove that label and that stigma, because you're meeting with a person who happens to have a criminal background and history. The working with probation and parole and the parole officers was really very unique, I think, and one that we at Rutland Plywood really sought out to kind of solidify that, and not to go behind the employee's back, but really more as a partnership. And our employers or viewing audience may be thinking, well, that sounds like a lot of work. What I would say is that there are resources available to us as employers in the community that we don't often know about or take advantage of. And where else can you pick up the phone and call on behalf of an employee without getting into their personal lives and business,
Right.
and get support either from probation and parole or creative workforce solutions for an employee who may be struggling? That isn't available for everybody in the workplace,
Right.
but it is available for those employers who are open to the possibilities. And I personally saw people's lives literally change. And it was very rewarding and also really heartbreaking, as we all know, that when our factory burned, that there were people who lost their jobs, and some are doing really well and have moved into a new workplace situation, and their lives are going on. But I would strongly encourage, because my mind has changed completely. So I've had the experience, and both of you have been really wonderful to be able to work with, and just as I say, I call it partnering with the employee.
It is a partnership, you're right. And I just want to touch base on a key thing, which you discussed, which was the relationship from the employer to probation and parole. I like to look at that as, if an employer is concerned or worried, you have somebody else who's a member of that team. And absolutely, going back to Keith's comment, is more people on that team, the greater opportunity for success. And you're right. More often than not, what we see and hear is the unbelievable stories and how working with somebody with a criminal history or any other barrier can truly impact somebody, even the employer, their outlook on what they thought may take place in hiring and taking a chance. What you find is there's a lot of skilled people out there with criminal histories, and you just need to be able to look past that criminal history aspect. There is a lot of skilled people out there with criminal histories. Some make mistakes.
Is there any particular advice that you would give to employers? So for me, I was plunged into it. I accepted that responsibility when I accepted the job at Rutland Plywood, so it was, you need to figure this out. And thankfully, I was really welcomed by you, Keith, when we met and you kind of explained, how things work. But what about employers who have never ever hired someone with a criminal background, or maybe they have, but it hasn't needed to have been disclosed because maybe it was past a time period, because some employers will say, if it's past 7 years and not in these particular areas, you don't even need to tell us about it. But what about employers who may find out about this or have it disclosed? What recommendations or advice do you have for them?
Well, for one benefit that they can receive from communicating with the probation officer is to get a sense of what's the history has been. If the person had been incarcerated, for instance, what are the specific programs that that person participated in? So that gives you an indication of motivation, or what was their work history in the institution. And so we're giving some background information, I think, that's critical for the employer. What particular skill have they demonstrated in the past? What kind of setting do you think that they could be successful in? What's their stability in the community right now? Or what are the things that we should be aware of? And without going into specifics, I mean, the person's history is public record. So if they want to do the background and look at affidavit, they can do all that. But I think it's important to remember that we can determine if change has occurred to a large degree by their motivation, their participation. So that's, I think, very helpful. So that's a phone call. And if the employer wants a face-to-face with the probation officer, that's great. And like Kris said, if you form a team around the individual, and that individual that's seeking employment understands, I think that's one of the big things that happened at Rutland Plywood is they were encouraged. They were supported, and that to them made a big difference, as opposed to just going into a job and doing the job, hitting it, punching out, and going home. So I think that that's the difference that I see with these employers that are really stepping up and taking the opportunity and the risk in some cases, obviously. But one of our highest risk people that we ever that came out into the community started in a particular job and was promoted within that job, saved enough money, bought his own home, and that's just a capitalization of one particular success story that's huge. And so when an employer sees that success, then they're more willing to take a chance the next time, and that's what we're seeing. I was sitting at the business luncheon a year ago with somebody from the construction field, and we were talking about people's success and individuals, and he named an individual that had been through one of our structured programs that was now employed by their company and doing a fabulous job. And we didn't know the connection until we started talking, and so that was an unsolicited confirmation of how well that employee was doing. It's great.
And just to kind of build off that, I was involved in that case as well, and it really was how I approached it was a resume. And then the employer just said, wow, I'd really like to meet this person, which then engaged me in the conversation about his criminal history and the opportunity to sell his skill set, as we're talking now with Ban the Box. I was able to sell his skill set first prior to his criminal history. And by the time I got to his criminal history, it really didn't matter. What the business saw was the skill set this man had. And to my knowledge, the last time I checked and spoke with this business a few weeks ago, still a year later, he's asking me, do you have any more just like him?
That's fantastic. It's so exciting to hear.
Yeah. And the other thing with what we can divulge is an indicator, that they had any disciplinary behavioral problems within the time that they were incarcerated. We can reveal that, and without breaking confidentiality, and that tells you a lot. Was the person compliant in the environment and accepted responsibility for their behavior? So that's key too.
I think that, when you're talking about what you can and can't disclose, that, as you know, was part of our conversation, and the way that three of us worked together was for me to identify specifically, here's the working environment. You already knew, what our facility looked like because you'd been on a tour. If you hadn't, I would have taken you on one. And what specifically are we looking for? What are the demands of the job, so that when we were partnering together, you already knew about the job as well as I knew about the job. so that whoever was being recommended, and we went through this with the probation officers as well, so that whoever was being recommended, it was kind of that first step, and you can look at it as potentially screening people out. I looked at it as screening people in, and that really was a respectful way for us to work together to find that person, regardless of their criminal history, that it really was about finding that best match. And then the other thing that I think we did particularly well was having that really open conversation with that applicant. So we were getting applicants that already had some skills and ability to do the job, and the match was kind of like that first step from probation and parole or creative workforce solutions. And then the next part of that, as part of the interviewing process, was talking about, all right, how can we, be supportive of you?
Exactly.
And how do we not get into your personal business? So we would have a very intentional conversation with the candidate and say, so when you're struggling in these areas, which you've said, hey, here are some challenges for me. How can we, make sure that you get that support outside of what we can do? And it was very often partnering with the probation officer. So it came from an area of concern. It didn't cross any boundaries. So I'm saying that on purpose to employers who may feel like, oh boy, this is too much information. How do I make sure I'm not getting too much information or being disrespectful without realizing it and crossing a boundary? I think that both of you do a really good job supporting employers through that process. And we certainly, I would say we were more successful than we were unsuccessful. We pretty much had a pretty open door policy, and were able to invite lots of folks, even if it maybe wasn't quite the match. But overall, I think that we saw a lot of people come through and at least get their first kind of leg up in employment and move on from there, which was always the goal.
Yeah.
So hearing about someone who has, kind of moved up in the ranks and able to purchase their own home, I mean, that's what we all want for members of our community.
Right.
Absolutely.
And that's really the essence of it, is making the community safe by having people employed and stable in their lives, and that's a win-win for the whole community. So the more that we can encourage employers to take that chance, we're all better off who live in these communities.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to state too that often people with criminal histories don't have the confidence at times to approach a business. So things like you've done at Rutland Plywood, there was a huge added bonus that maybe you didn't see from the employer's side, which is it wasn't just a paycheck. You offered an opportunity for success to somebody, and you also gave the opportunity for somebody to think, nobody's going to give me a chance with my criminal history, and you offered the opportunity for somebody with a criminal history to say, somebody actually does care about me, and there is an opportunity here for me to succeed. And I'm not saying that every single one, we've all seen those failures as well, but the opportunity, the door open for success is a lot easier to walk through than one that's slammed shut. So, and you opened a lot of doors for people. So after they walk through, it's really on them, but you gave the opportunity.
And I would also have to say to our viewers to really consider, what guarantees do we have with any employee? Any employee. Just because we do our screening process and have those, really good conversations during interviews and do the background and reference checks, there's no guarantee that that employee is a fit either.
Right.
So kind of adding, on to kind of that barrier to employment that this person can't be successful because of their criminal history, I think is, the blinders need to come off, because that's not necessarily true.
That's true. Criminal history, the way I look at it as in my role going talk to businesses, I work with any barrier to employment. We work with, a criminal history is just another barrier. It really is. And obviously it's a bigger barrier. It's a little bit different conversation that need to be had. You talked about how scary it was for you to jump into this. Look at it from my role and how scary it can be to approach a business saying, hey, I would like to talk to you about this consumer we're working with, and oh, by the way, there's this criminal history we need to discuss. So it can be scary, but throughout that relationship and the conversations with the business and the opportunities to talk about the resources and support out there, there's opportunities. So yeah, it can be scary from this side as well, not just the employer side.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I think it's also important to remember the challenge that we have right now in the state and across the country, that with the opiate crisis, that, that people are falling into addiction that had led perfectly normal lives prior to falling prey to addiction, and so may have inherited criminal conviction as a result. But if they're participating in their treatment program, if they're successful in their treatment program, if their life is coming back into normalcy, then that's a person that shouldn't be excluded. And that's what I think one of the highlights of this particular legislation is that could be a person that would, would have had to check that box for criminal history, and the employer, could have excluded that person without understanding the full impact of what had transpired in that person's life and what they were before, and what they brought to an employer before the addiction took over. And so we're seeing many people that are being successful in treating their addiction, so that are getting back into the employment field and being successful. So.
Well, I know we've seen a number through our community reentry panels, which I want to put a plug in for, because that is helping people, restore their lives and make amends to the community for what has happened. And part of that is employment, because that sort of stability is just so vitally important to that person as well as our community. I have to say, I was getting a cup of coffee the other day, and one of the folks that we saw probably about a year ago has been working with for a particular employer, and I heard this familiar voice, and they're still employed there. They've moved up, they're in a management role, and
Wow.
that couldn't have happened if that employer didn't say, and this was pre-ban the box.
Yeah.
So, it's pretty exciting that employer just said, it matters, but it doesn't matter enough to exclude you from participating in our workforce. So it's pretty exciting.
That's great.
And I think that it's also pretty invisible, right?
Yeah.
Because if I have a criminal background, it's not something that I want to go around highlighting. I have to own it. I have to be responsible. But if that's all that I put forward, versus here I am working successfully, I'm not going to, kind of raise a red flag and wave it and say, hey, by the way, I've successfully kind of integrated back, and I'm really participating as a viable member of our community. So we don't see a lot of those successes, so it's really exciting to hear you talk about them.
Yeah.
That's great.
That's the good thing I think about, at least with my role, is I get to see them every day. They're not often talked about. You don't hear about them in the community, but I see that success every day.
We have just about 2 minutes left. Is there anything that you wanted to be sure that you highlighted or mentioned?
One thing for me,
didn't get a
I think
chance to
I've talked a
mention.
lot about, maybe alluded to people coming out of incarceration, but our bigger number of people that we supervise are on probation or parole. So, and if a person is placed on probation from the court, that means that there were probably a number of, even though it was a felony, there was a number of stability factors that existed that caused that person to get probation as opposed to incarceration. So just because the felony may show up doesn't mean that, that person didn't have a lot going for them prior to the crime. So I think that's a distinction that people might not understand given the conversation that we've had so far. So.
Kris, anything that you think is important to add?
I would just welcome any business that may see this and has questions or is interested in taking a look at this, workforce, to feel free to reach out to me, and I will support you the best I can, and as you go forward in taking a look at this population.
Great. Well, I also want to just put my stamp of approval on working with you two gentlemen. You have been amazing and always accessible, and really helped create some wonderful success stories for members of our community. So thank you for everything that you do and continue to do. And thanks for being here on our program.
Thanks for having
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And to our viewing audience, thank you for being with us. And I would remind you that all workforce matters, and ban the box. Its impact is real. And remember, it's the law. It's also the right thing to do. Have Have a great day.